Okay. Okay, hello. Well, one. Okay, so sorry. Yes, thank you for that cue. Welcome everyone that is joining us online and today with us in the side event. So I propose we start right away without any more delays. We have a packed schedule for today, and we would like to start by saying that we think we have a very special and perhaps a bit different side event today. Together, we would like to explore how the imagery of melting ice, being widespread in the media, by the media in general, uh, is a potential inducing factor of eco-anxiety, and why and also how science and education can work together to craft effective tools and policies to counter this feeling and empower our youth to protect our cryosphere. For this purpose, we have around the non-existent table representatives of the press world, the science, the youth, and the education sector. The way we'll be organizing the side event, we'll start by some general presentations, and then we will try to foster a lively discussion. So I propose we start right away and give the floor to Nicolas, who will introduce himself as a representative from the press. Nicolas.
Thank you, Jen. Where's the one? Can you hear me well? Yes. Thank you very much. So yeah, I don't claim to represent all of the press, but I'll give you maybe a personal take on the press and the cryosphere. So just as a quick word of background, I'm a podcast producer. Been doing that for the last 3 years. So my view of the press is just as much as everyone's, really, from a reader perspective and a listener perspective, and also a contributor. Um, the first question is really, how does the press cover the cryosphere, right? And to cover that, maybe I'll take you through two or three things. One thing is does the press know about the cryosphere, right? And how it and knowing about the cryosphere, what is it? So does it know about the word? I'll tell you something. I didn't know cryosphere as a word. I've only learned it in the last few. I mean, it's quite recent. It's probably a few months. It's not years for sure. And I don't think I'm alone in that respect. So there's usage of the word. So does the press use the word cryosphere? I think we can all agree that it doesn't, very little, right? And when I say press, I mean mostly print press, but also TV and radio, so mainstream media. I don't think the word cryosphere is represented very well. This being said, we can talk about the cryosphere without using the word, right? And I think the press does that to some extent. Does it do it well or not? It's probably part of the discussion today. Does it understand the role? Does the press understand the role of the cryosphere, right? Because you could talk about it as long as you know what it is, then that's fine if you don't use the word. It does, probably, but not as much as people around here. So it's very easy to think that we all know what the cryosphere is and what the impact is and what the stakes are, because we're all, especially here, in a very closed environment. If you go outside, and especially if you go to the mainstream public, which is fed by the press, the understanding is, I think, very limited. But most importantly, does the press know the stakes and the impact of, say, the melting of the ice? Very little as well, I would think. I think it's fair to remember that the press is good at short term, and it's good at what just happened or what is happening now. It doesn't look in the future very much, right? If you simply because it has time constraints and there's plenty of things to talk about, and I'm talking about generalist media. If you look at the example of what's hot in the news, sorry for the point, the Gaza and Israel war, right? What do we talk about? We don't talk about what's going to happen in the next year or 2 years and what's at stake, what will happen eventually. The press just reports what's happening today, what happened yesterday, effectively. And I think the same goes even more so with complicated topics that the press doesn't understand, like the cryosphere. But you could So talking about it without knowing much about it is obviously a big risk. Now, like I said at the beginning, you could talk about the cryosphere in the media without using the word. And I think to some extent, the press does that, and it relies on the science and the scientists. The problem is, when does it talk about the cryosphere, right? So in France, I can only talk for what I see. The press covers the melting of the ice and the disappearance of glaciers only when it's hot, so only in the summer, right? Which is obviously not the way I'm sure people around here would like it to be. So it's a very limited scope and view of what the impact is. What it does talk about, you have to remember that the press is very good also. It's good at short term and it's good at local. It's good at what impacts people. So if you live in a country where you're very far from either the sea and even more so to the glaciers, the cryosphere is never going to be mentioned. And by nature, the press simplifies. That's what it has to do because it's mostly mainstream press. And therefore, it can only go as much as what the journalists understand and what they think that their audience understands. Now, when we say the press, we've been saying the press. I just want to point out that there's different aspect of what the press is or the media is, right? Well, I had slides, but obviously, yeah, where are they? It doesn't matter, doesn't matter. So we say we, as journalists, we say we, the press, but in fact, the media is multiple, right? And the press is multiple. Of course, like we said, there's TV, there's radio, there's print, which is what we know about. But more and more, there's podcasts, which takes some time. So the inspiration from podcasts is mostly long-form journalism. So deep, dense articles and coverages, which gives time to explore using multiple voices from mostly experts. So I think we should be hopeful that this is a new way to convey the messages that we want people to get. In addition to podcasts, there's obviously social, right? Being YouTube, if you consider that social, but short form videos made by people, regular people, not journalists, and of course social media in the larger sense. Now, is that a good pathway towards better information about the cryosphere? Not really. It's like choose your poison between eco-anxiety and misinformation, really. But it does give hope that it's by multiplying the type of formats and support through which information is being conveyed, there is more chances that the press will use those supports to pass that information. And by giving them more chances to pass that information, they have to adapt to a different type of content and different type of format and different expectations also. So I think the press, just as a way, as a wrap-up word, maybe, I think that the multiplication of supports, that's fine. Yeah, that's me. That's all I'll take away from this slide. No, that's fine. I want to, maybe the last takeaway is by offering or by relying now on more support to pass the information, effectively the press has got to adapt to different expectations, and they also have to adapt to, or we also have to adapt to more. I think the public has come to a point where they know as much as the journalists, and the journalists have to level up their game, and they have multiple avenues to do that, being podcasts, social, and so on. And I think not everything is to throw away in terms of what we see on social media and then in the press in general. We just need to give a chance to the press to get better. And I think hopefully science and people working on education as part of their daily job will help the press, whose job is not to educate, but to inform. But surely we can find a middle ground whereby information doesn't mean bad education and eco-anxiety. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.
I think it was an amazing benchmark. So it's going to be hard to start from them. But yeah, thank you very much, Nicola, for your perspective. Mine is going to be a little bit different, but I would actually like to take some distance a little bit with my scientist hat and talk about my personal experience as a young student and then scientist and glaciologist in particular, who started working on the impact of climate change about 15 years ago. Because I think that the link between climate change and the general public is actually really different today than it has been 15 years ago. And I would like to just give you some of my representation around that and my very humble analysis. So I started working on climate change impact on East Antarctica in 2008. And actually, I went straight to Antarctica, and I was working in a part of the continent that was not actually really melting at that time. And that's why we were monitoring it. We were looking for new changes that were showing that climate change was actually arriving. But being there, we were noticing actually a little bit more ice falling in some parts of the continent. So it was really the beginning. But I have to say that half of the people I met at that time were whether not aware of climate change. Actually, for most of them, and the one that knew were always asking me if it was true what we were saying about the impact of climate change on melting ice. So we were starting from, being really far away from where we are today. And on this graph, I actually, try to represent the evolution of the climate change theme in the media, covered by media over time. So it started in 2010. And if we look at the numbers, we can see that in 2010, we have less than 0.5% of the 0.6% of the topics that covered climate change. We can see a little bump in 2015 during COP21, of course, but then it decreased again. And actually, as Europe and the US and France in particular, this is for France in the press, we see a large increase, but it's still really small, actually. And I think 2022 really made a change in the way media started covering that topic, because it arrived in everyone's home. So if I try to analyze from my perspective what was missing 10 or 15 years ago to really have that media attention, but that public attention in general, I think first it was a lack of media coverage and a lack of understanding of the importance of the issue, probably, but also too much distance to what we were, to what climate change was actually preparing. Then I think also from my scientific perspective, a lack of communication from scientists towards general public. I've seen a lot of changes related to that over the last years. When I started my PhD, talking to media was not education in general from scientists, from experts, was not always something that was valued. For example, today, if you create a research project, you pretty much always have an education aspect or a communication aspect that is related to that. But this is still something new, and it was not the case 15 years ago. So of course, then a lack of education. Now climate change starts to be distillated in the school programs, and but it's still something really new. We see that the Office for Climate Education was created only in 2018, so it's still really something close to us, and also a problem in the representation of the issue related to melting ice in that case, and a lack of link to human impacts. And I think that picture actually did a lot of damage over time because we always related melting ice and melting of polar regions to the loss of biodiversity of our ecosystems, but we didn't make the link between these regions and our society. So talking about sea level rise, talking about ocean acidification, talking about the link between polar regions and the functioning of our climate and things like that. And also, of course, climate skepticism. We have someone really famous in France that is called Claude Allègre, and she has been minister. He was a geologist, if I'm not wrong. But actually, he for years he fought against climatologists, climate scientists, explaining that climate change was not something true. So a lot of people actually really liked having that idea that this was not a real problem. So over that time, we have to say that we also had some protection from the ocean for a very long time. 25% of the CO2 has gone into the ocean, which means that it gave us some time actually before really seeing the effects of climate change, the strong effects of climate change. And actually today, the average surface temperature would have warmed by 36 degrees without the ocean instead of 1.2 degrees today. So yeah, it put in over time, but we could not see the impacts we are seeing today. As a glaciologist, as a scientist working in the polar regions, 15 years ago, we could already see the impacts of climate change. This was in Greenland. So it's a photo taken at the surface of the ice sheet where we can see some melt water that is coming from the increase of the temperature in the atmosphere that is melting the surface of the ice sheet, and then decreasing in altitude, and then nourishing and feeding that melting. In Antarctica, this picture was taken in 2015, and these were the first surface matter found that I could see there. It was over Research Glacier in East Antarctica, so a place where we see the changes only for, we can measure them only for 3 years. But this was already present, something that was already taken into account in Greenland, in the Arctic, but was really new to that place. Just to contextualize a little bit, so Greenland is mainly melting from the surface, but Antarctica is actually melting from the ocean. The surface air temperature increases the temperature of the ocean, that then melts the ice shelves from underneath, and then carve many more icebergs and drain a lot of ice towards the ocean. But 2015, this was new for me. And if we look at that graph, we see why scientists, especially the one working on the cryosphere, have been witnessing these effects for a very long time, but could not see them very strongly in the northern hemisphere. It's just because the Arctic has been melting too, and today it's 4 times faster than the rest of the world because of the polar amplification. And today we know that the Antarctic as well as the Hindu Kush Himalaya are melting 2 times faster than the global average. And and then you have the increase of the temperature globally, so which is larger over the continent than over the oceans. So yeah, we could see what was coming because everything was amplified in Nepal. But I think that the fact that we had some time from the effect of the ocean and the fact that we had already some clues from the polar regions means that today we actually get the climate change in our face very strongly, if I can say that. And the urgency sense feeds into the anxiety feeling that we're getting today, because we are already committed to 1.5 degrees of warming. We know also that the impact of climate change are actually higher and stronger than what we were expecting at lower temperature. So I think all this story actually means that today we realize really what is happening, but a little bit too late. So just looking at the different impact from climate change actually really linked to our society and feeds that eco-anxiety feeling. I think the first one and the very obvious one is the increase of the sea level. So the current rate is about 4 millimeters per year, but it's increasing, accelerating over time. And I wanted to show that graph from the era 6, and especially that curve here, which was qualified as low likelihood, high impact storyline, because it was based on one or two studies actually, and one from Toyota. And what we can see today is there are many more studies that were released over the last months that actually show that we might be following that curve, which means that by the end of the century, we are pretty much committed to 1 meter of sea level rise. But if we look at 2300, sorry, if we have low emission scenario, it would range between 1 to 3 meters. But looking at the pathways we are currently following, which are not the best ones, of course, we would be committed to 2 up to even 10 meters of sea level rise, which means very strong consequences. And this is in part related to the fact that we are crossing some thresholds. And a few weeks ago, study was released on the West Antarctica showing that this basin is pretty much committed to disappear and to participate to the increase of sea level of about 5 meters over the coming centuries because of the increase of temperature in the ocean. But even if we maintain the temperature increase of 1.5 degrees, we are committed to see that ice disappearing and participating to sea level rise. So then we have to adapt because some impacts are now irreversible. So if we look at numbers, having 1 meter of sea level rise would mean 1 billion people will be affected. So we have to whether move within the country or even leave the country. So we have to deal with that migration issue, of course. And if we look at the loss of glacier just in the Himalayan, in the crucial Himalayan sector, we are committed to see 2 billion people affected by the loss of these glaciers, which is of course linked to agriculture, to hydropower, etc. Just looking at very quickly at that map. So of course, it's also something that is developing today. We see more and more people living really close to the coast. So that would mean having people moving whether within a country or outside a country. And a few weeks ago, Australia actually agreed on welcoming the population from Vanuatu to their country because they are actually losing their coast. But Vanuatu is really small. But when we talk about Bangladesh, when we talk about Pakistan, when we talk about Japan, etc., it really means billions of people that will be affected. Just looking at another example of impact that is showing this kind of irreversibility, we have ocean acidification. And we know that reaching 2 degrees of warming would mean actually having an acidic ocean for over 30,000 years. So it would mean that we need at least that time to recover and come back to the level we know today. So of course, it doesn't give any time to biodiversity to adapt to that changes. And 2023 was a very special year when we talk about sea ice, especially in the Antarctic. So this is not the best example, but of course it has been changing in the Arctic. We lost 40% of the surface of sea ice over the last 40 years. And now the ice remaining is pretty much the very young ice. So the one that is formed during the previous winter and then disappear at the end of the summer following. That's why we have a lot of blue and we don't have the multi-year ice anymore, which was really important for the biodiversity. But we also have a very strong decrease of the Antarctic sea ice that seems to be crossing some thresholds as well. So yeah. And the loss of sea ice is, of course, linked to the thermal line circulation, which means that would also impact different countries and our local weather. So just to conclude, so the process has already begun. Some effects will be irreversible and avoidable. The impacts will be felt for hundreds of years and even for thousands of years if we look at acidification. But this is a very strong message that we try to keep here at ICCI. There is still time for us to react and choose the future we want, especially sticking to the 1.5 degrees scenario. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lydie, for the presentation, and Nicolas as well, for sharing both the coverage of the cryosphere in the media and the scientific evolution over time of the state as well, the cryosphere. I would like to bring Eleonora onto the stage now. So, Eleonora, Lydie mentioned we could see that coming. That's what she said. And as a youth, did you see it coming at all? How does the imagery of actually the cryosphere has impacted you personally? Have you ever learned about cryosphere and climate change at school? How is your experience as a youth and as a student regarding your education in climate change and cryosphere?
Let's try to answer all that. Hey, good morning or midday. My name is Aliénor Rougeau, or Ali, if it's easier to pronounce. I'm originally from France, but I've been living in Canada, Treaty 13 territory for the past 7-8 years. My day job is with environmental defense. I'm a program manager there. I work on energy and climate issues, but I was very involved throughout my youth, throughout my middle school, high school, and university in youth climate movements. And I still today do a lot of this dialogue with youth to try to get more folks to, find their own path to being active within the fight against climate change. So I appreciate those questions and I appreciate the opportunity to think that through. If that's okay, I'll share a bit of how I got there, not because I think it's like an exceptional story or example, but more because it's a case study of some of the things educators might want to think about when they're thinking about bringing up these really stressful, complicated topics that we were just covering. As you were presenting, Lydie, I was feeling again that restlessness and anxiety, but that can be a good thing. So just to share that initially, when I was, perhaps like 10, 12, early ages, I was more concerned, as perhaps any young person is, around more direct things that you would care about. I was concerned about animals. I was concerned increasingly within teenage years about, in our case, refugee rights. I lived in the south of France. There were massive refugee waves. So early stages of me trying to get involved in anything were more focused on those very direct, things that you want to help solve. And as I was doing, school presentations around refugee rights, and the importance of being a welcoming country, someone mentioned, I think one of my teachers said, oh, and with climate change, the refugee crisis is going to get so much worse. And it just kind of made a passing comment. And I was like, what are you talking about? What is, I've just never really been aware of that. And so that night I went and I did a lot of Googling of, what's climate change? And what popped up was pretty much that image that you showed, like the polar bear in the ice. And then I watched a few videos, and keep in mind, YouTube was like a more basic version of what it is now. So most of the videos were very like scientific, trying to explain greenhouse gases going in and not back out, and things like that. So it was very technical, and it was, I think, a mix of, it was a weird mix of alarming because it seemed really bad, but also really impossible to connect with, and most importantly, like impossible to know how I could possibly help. Right? It was just like, this seems so foreign from my, and this polar bear seems so far away. And so that panic definitely settled in. And the first way I took it was a hard hit on me personally. I was thinking, oh, I'm part of the problem. Humans are a huge problem. We are, this is devastating. And so I think maybe even before the anxiety, it was like eco guilt. Like I was just devastated. So I, perhaps very conveniently for the fossil fuel industry, I started focusing more on myself, my personal footprint, what I was doing wrong, how I fix it. So I start being very annoying to my parents and saying, I'm going vegetarian. I don't want to take the plane. I don't want to do this, right? I start really blaming myself, doing all these efforts. I'm really focused. And as you can imagine, like, that's not a comfortable place to be. You're just stressed all the time. You feel really bad about yourself. And then a few years go by, and this IPCC report that had really made the headlines, that one report that I was explaining, that we had 10 years to get it right on climate before irreversible things were going to start happening, that those headlines really hit me in a terrible way, because I thought, I've been doing a great amount of effort right now, a great amount of personal sacrifice. I gave up food that I liked, and these headlines are telling me, we're doing very poorly. We have 10 years. And so I went from, I think, this like eco guilt to complete despair, thinking, well, now there's nothing I can do, like, clearly. And so I think that was when I really felt the peak of the eco anxiety, was that mismatch between what I'm trying to do as someone that cares and what I keep being told, which is it's not working. And that was really the bulk of the discrepancy. And then what kind of changed that around and converted into productive eco anxiety, I guess, was that there were two moments that happened very close to each other. Greta Thunberg, the famous Swedish climate activist, started doing her school strikes in Sweden, and that started gaining popularity, and we started seeing a few early waves of European movements of school climate strikes. It hadn't reached North America yet. So we were seeing that, and I was a bit curious, not yet convinced that it was going to work, but sure. And then at the same time, in my province of Ontario in Canada, we had a really anti-environment government that had just gotten elected, and within the first 2 days, just got rid of the environment commissioner, got rid of the auditor general on environment, just got rid of every law, policy, or system to protect the environment and push back against climate change, canceled a bunch of renewable energy deals. I mean, just like went all of that. And so those two things kind of awakened me to the world of more collective action, to the world of a whole new part that's not the individual part. And the reason I wanted to share this was that there's still a gap, right? So now you see the movements in Europe, you see this government doing something, but you still don't know how you can possibly impact it. Again, at that time, I'm like, say, 17 or something like that, 16, 17. And what changed everything was me meeting a group of, in this case, it was actually moms and grandmas based in Toronto in Canada, who were trying to do more and more dialogues within, schools with different community groups, and who were basically starting to lead very small protests. And I met them, and they basically told me, however you want to express whatever you're feeling, we will support you. It was like a unconditional support of whatever your vision is for what you think is going to solve it, we will help you. So, we tried different versions of like an art installation or a teaching. We tried different sorts of actions. We did converge back to big mass mobilizations as that was what was needed. But really what changed it, and what changed from like a powerlessness to feeling like I was actively doing something, was this kind of unconditional support and empowerment. And so when I think of this kind of like arc that I went through, I think of a few lessons. The first one is that just facts, absent of any either like context or solution focus, just pure facts, might make a young person educated, don't get me wrong, but it was not going to make them a productive contributor to the fight. So, is that what we want to do? Probably not. And it will also make them extremely eco-anxious, which we know is dangerous for a whole lot of reasons. Another thing was how important it was for me to be ready to hear that information. So I don't know, because I didn't have lessons about climate change at school that much, but I wonder if I had just a lesson on it, would I have taken it so personally? But because I was looking for that information, I was searching that, I was primed, I was ready to absorb the knowledge, it actually reached me much deeper, and I actually kept it. So wondering how we can create the emotional moment first for a young person to then want the information aspect, right? And in that order, instead of trying to use the information to create an emotion, which usually creates a really negative, hard emotion. And then the third one is maybe like goes without saying, and that's why even though I'm less and less young, I'm still trying to get very involved within like youth movements and schools, is that intergenerational support was huge. It's awesome to have youth groups, but I think youth groups in isolation of a support structure of people who've done this work before, people who have expertise, kind of probably doesn't lead to the most powerful action. So I'm a huge supporter of some sort of intergenerational, conversations. And maybe just to share a few things that I've observed since kind of moving away from myself being kind of the youth impacted and going into classrooms and seeing the change. The key themes we always see, especially with relationships to melting sea ice, melting ice, those images, is always that same feeling even today of it is so far from me and I don't know how to intervene. And also I don't know how it matters to me. So it's that both like, I don't know whether I care. And if I do care, I don't know what to do about it. Maybe just to open up, I will share one initiative I'm part of that I hope will help, which is an initiative where it's called the Arctic Angels. They decided to take, so Global Choices approached a lot of, they chose young women in this case, a lot of young women who were doing existing other work. It might be climate activism, but it might be like education for girls work, whatever it is, like other young women doing activism work. And they told them, we will teach you about the Arctic for a few days or for a few, sessions. And then can you try to weave that in the existing work you're doing? And so that initiative, I mean, it's still within earlier stages, but it's allowed a lot of people to, and especially they don't just go to communities that are, concerned by the Arctic, like Canada in our case was maybe a natural fit, but we have a lot of global South folks. We have a lot of folks that aren't directly tied to the Arctic, because we know that what happens in the Arctic impacts people from the global South, people from everywhere. So that was the theory, was to go and find those champions somewhere else. And the idea of why that would work is we know people receive better the information from someone they already trusted. So from someone that looks like them, that sounds like them, that's within the same community or at least the same country. So we'll see how that continues to pan out. But for now, it's been at least successful in reaching new networks of people who had never thought of the Arctic as something they would care about. So yeah, that's an initial thought, and happy to follow up after.
Wow, thank you, Alina, for such a personal yet invigorating, I want to say, experience. Tough act to follow, though, but I think Nicolas here is up for the task. Nicolas, I invite you to the stage. Can you share with us a bit more about, how can we actually bring climate change into the education sector, into the schools? in what, how can we make it engaging, not equal anxiety inducing? And you also mentioned it, and at the same time, local. How do we do all of that?
Okay, that's my mission. Thank you, Gian. My name is Nicolas. Is it works? Yes. I'm an education officer at the Office for Climate Education. I have been a teacher for 14 years. And first of all, I would like to start with this covered page of a handbook from high school. Yes. And this is a chapter related to, focused on energy, development, and future. And I chose to highlight that, to illustrate that by wildfire. So that's really, really interesting because, and I'm really proud of this mind map because it's really exactly what you said, Ali. This image, this document is shows suffering. So my assumption is that can create eco-anxiety, just as you mentioned. It's a professional image, so students cannot take this kind of a picture. Of course, it requires a lot of skills of technical devices, etc. So it's really far from us and from there, and it's far geographically. So personally, I never see a wildfire like that. Maybe you, but I think those kind of information that it's a professional image and that's geographic distance, my assumption is that could create a kind of psychological distance too. So how we work at the Office for Climate Education, we create those kinds of handbook, and we are not using this kind of picture. I will explain you why. In these handbooks, we provide to teachers lots of resources and activity where we can use active pedagogy. So, for example, we use the inquiry-based learning. Here we have two pictures from Lydie, and we ask to teacher and to students melting of which ice causes sea level rise. So it could be ice on land or sea ice. And then we ask a teacher and student to brainstorm, to thinking, to give some assumption, and then to carry out some experiments to demonstrate the cause of sea level rise. After that, they can have new knowledge, new skills, and we work a lot of skills with through these methods. For example, problem framing or critical thinking, and then have facts to explain the world we are living. So in all our resources, for example, this handbook, but also the IPCC summary or video or multimedia animation, we give them facts. And as you explained, facts and knowledge are not enough. So I just would like to show you this information. There is a beautiful paper of from the IFD 2023, which demonstrate that climate change education helps to improve students' knowledge, but not only knowledge, attitude, and skills too. And as you can see just here, there is important thing in these reports. There are intergenerational learning effects, exactly as you mentioned, Adi. So that's really interesting because researcher, science, and lots of papers point that climate change education works, and that lots effects, especially in the whole school approach, with the environment of students, through their parents and grandparents, etc. So that's really interesting because we believe in that. I will show you this graph. Here you have scientific study. They are looking for activity focused on knowledge, awareness, emotion, action, habit, etc. And we can see here the effects, the outcomes of those activities. And we can see that activity developed by teachers focused on knowledge work. They work really good, but we have numbers of other tools to educate people in climate change education. So if you are only focused on knowledge, maybe that could create anxiety. and that does not lead to action. Here you have an example of action. This is exactly the project-based pedagogy. In our handbooks, we have the first part of understand, how we understand the climate change, and then we have the part 2 on this handbook. It's how we can act, how we can design projects and implement in school, in the town, in the city, in the family to tackle climate change. In this book, we also have role-playing games, and we encourage teachers to get outdoor to foster nature connection that's really relevant in climate change education. So my takeaway message is knowledge are not enough. They are working, but it's not enough. Here we have a curve showing the level of engagement as a function of anxiety. And as you mentioned just before, you used the word proactive anxiety, something like that. Useful anxiety, I think so. Yes. So here we have exactly a useful anxiety. So I just not want that pupil and students become anxious, but indeed we can see that a certain level of anxiety could create a level of engagement. And in the planting tree, in eating vegetable, in brainstorming about the future, maybe we can decrease this level of anxiety. So my point is just to use this exactly first part of the curve. Here you have emotion related to climate change. If we ask students to what are they feeling when they are thinking of climate change, we can see that they are feeling sad, afraid, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and after that, optimistic. So the majority of the feeling, of course, are negative, but there are some positive effects and negative effect or neutral, but the enormous, the huge majority of feeling are negative. And we have to take that in account when we teach climate change and when we create resources on climate change, of course. So to do that, I would like to show you this document. This is a document on tipping points. Tipping points, global tipping points, not scientific consensus, and that's really tricky, and that could create anxiety. And in our handbooks, we avoid to use those tipping points because, of course, that could create a lot of anxiety. And we recommend to use more other kinds of documents. I will show you why. For example, this one is IPCC documents, and I just would like to take your attention on the scale. This is a big geographic scale and a big time scale too. So this kind of document is really complicated for little students. We can have thinking of the color. This one, yes. All this document is in red. I perfectly know that red symbolizes heat, and that's because in infrared radiation, they are red. So in IPCC reports, we can use the red to symbolize that. But maybe we can just have that in mind when we create document for students, especially for the, in primary school. Why always using red? Because there are a lot of symbolic charge associated with the red color. In the Middle Age, for example, the red is really often used because the pigments are available, but in the history, red is associated with love, with hate, with sin. So why always red in all documents related to warming? Scientists, especially Ojala, create and give us lots of tools to imagine new way of thinking, new way of create documents. And you can see here blue, yellow, or green, but just so to cope with emotion, Ojala recommends to use activity related to emotion. Let's students express their emotion and to maybe cope with that with project-based learning and to get action. So it's exactly this kind of activity I just mentioned before. We can imagine activity in forest or planting tree or reflecting how to manage our waste and why it is important related to climate. And the third thing is meaning focused coping. And that's the question of the way of we talking about climate change and why it's important in our society for our values, for our way of thinking the world. And that's three kind of possibility to teach climate change. Oh, okay. I think it's okay. That's all for me, I think.
Great.
Yeah, no, I found this one too.
Okay.
I have time to that? Okay, fine.
There is a question for Nicolas, is that correct?
Maybe the part, if it is screwed on the screen, maybe he can write down and then we can look at it after.
Absolutely, and we can also share the slides with you with a great pleasure. I'm just very, very afraid that Nicolas has to not run but fly to his next side event as in immediately, please. Thank you so much, Nicolas. We can stay here for 5 more minutes discussion. Yes, absolutely, and maybe we can share Nicolas' slide on that end. No, maybe we cannot share it. No, we can't.
I have a comment now.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I'm Freddy Sebastian from Chile. I teach chemistry and biology. Equivalent to 12 years until 17 years old students. Well, it's events associated to education, and it's very tiny, should be huge to engage in a big stage because it's so important. Establishing this, it's really useful to have this graph between elongation and level of action.
Yeah.
Because even in Chile we have a IPCC group of scientists who has been very difficult to deal with because they say we don't want to come to the school to share our visions because we want to put more anxiety in the students.
Mhm.
And I try to use this that you put it available on your web page, this which is in 2019.
Oh, thank you.
And then our mission in South America has been to adapt to each local community. Yeah, it's very useful to have these graphics here for them.
Well, thank you so much. We will make sure to share them with you, and thank you for being using our resources from our second year of existence, actually. And I think there was this key term that was introduced by Eleanor of like useful anxiety that really is resonating with me and with around the room. And perhaps Lydie and Nicolas would like to comment on that. Like,
Thanks. I don't know about that, but I had a question, if I may, Jim, related to the point the gentleman just made. And in both Ali's and Nicholas's talks, they were mentioning that putting climate education in schools was going to be or is already something beneficial. What's in the way of making that more widespread? And subtext question, is it because of the subject or because of the information that we have? Is it a political obstacle? Maybe, do you want to comment on that or?
sure. Well, I do have a few elements to answer that, and we'll welcome Eleanor's remarks as well. I think there's a few barriers, right? We're talking about it. I mean, throughout COP, we're talking about it, right? That's one of our missions here. The first barrier, I think, is knowledge. It's making knowledge available for decision makers. proving that actually education works. Education is an adaptation measure. Education is the best investment, one of the best investments we can make for our future and for our climate future. There is barriers as well that are system-wide in terms of integration of climate change into the curricula, for example. We know that half of the curricula out there in the world do not even mention the words climate change yet. We know that most of the funding for this curricula actually doesn't, for the funding for climate change actually doesn't go into formal education, but actually country budgets, it goes to awareness raising actions. That's also an issue because again, research has shown that education is the one that actually transforms people's behaviors and not necessarily awareness. And I would say there's also a barrier in terms of access to sustainable funding and continuity of what our education actions on climate change. And for that, I think we have to work around finding common language between what does the international community, for example, at COP says on education. It is, a bit hidden inside Article 6, and ACE mechanism is one of the components among the 4 priority areas. It's a bit tricky to translate that to funder type of language and then into action and language that is understood at the ground level by educators, by directors, by local ministries of education. And as part of that, it's part of the wider contextualization of climate change education. And next, that is also contextualizing the issue to every local reality. It is a global problem. There is commonality there, but it's very important to bring it down and have it contextualized as well into the education system and into their lives. Eleanor, if you'd like to comment on this.
Yeah. Well, just briefly, some quick thoughts from the experience when we get brought into classrooms, and it's kind of like the first time a teacher brings anyone in on climate. Often the teacher themselves doesn't know much. For example, they say, "Oh, we're glad you're here. We just started a recycling program." And I'm like, recycling is great. It has nothing to do with carbon. But, so the first thing is the teacher can't actually support the students after, because I leave the class and then the teacher's like, so about this, and then, it's going to be so they don't have the right support throughout. That's why I like the idea of also bringing in parents and grandparents. Any point person that a child looks at for authority needs to be trained, because otherwise we have cases of people within our youth groups that are educating their parents constantly, but they're getting misinformation back from their parents. So there's that. And in North America, I'm not going to speak for Europe or anywhere else, but in North America, we have a fossil fuel lobby that is more powerful than what any of us can really grasp. It is, in Canada at least, a huge, huge part of our reality politically. And educational programs that curriculums are heavily lobbied about, so much so that in some of our provinces in Canada, we have very strongly pro-oil textbooks that will say that Canada's future relies on oil from Canada. It is not a joke that it is. It's political. So in Canada, at least, it's deeply political. It's not fact-based in how we decide what goes in the curriculum or not for that aspect. We do have a serious education system, but it gets influenced.
Well, but here's an interesting point, and it ties back to what you were mentioning and ties back to the core of our activity as the OCE, is providing tools to teachers that they can use when the system does not provide them for them or in a good way, and based on the IPCC reports, based on science, based on facts, I want to say, and in a way that, as Nicolas mentioned, we try to not bring eco-anxiety into the classrooms, and we also try to work with scientists to train them in a way that they also feel comfortable going into classrooms and that it's not a barrier, this eco-anxiety feeling to them. There was a remark?
Yes, I want to first thank all of you for this great testimonies and sharing. So I'm Eric Guillaume, I'm a climate scientist and also the president of NEWS. I wanted to come back to well, you can hear me. I wanted to come back to as a scientist, the narratives we are. You talked about this, and so we talked about. And one thing that has been coming, this idea of thresholds, of tipping points, which is still a research question. We don't know. If you take the IPCC reports, they are clear about. They may exist, but we don't know. But there are people in our science community who use those as something we know, and that's saying, well, we have threshold deadlines coming up at 10 years. We're asking what, which is 10 years. It's nothing in the IPCC report is written as 10 years. It's some media written like this, telling a story, a narrative, and the power of the narrative is really important. The people using those tipping points for planetary boundaries, which again, there's no scientific consensus on their existence, are using this storyline maybe to try to go up in that curve of level of engagement and anxiety, but sometimes it goes too far. And it goes too far because when they publish a paper saying, well, we passed 6 of the 9 so-called existing boundaries, then people say, well, tough. It's doomed anyway, so why act? Or the way people can say, oh, we have to do quickly geoengineering. So it's bringing bad policy advice and creating a lot of anxiety. So I think as scientists, we have a responsibility to say the way we frame what we know and what we don't know. It's just certainly what we're trying to do also within the OC. But it's really for us scientists to educate about the impact of the narrative we're taking. The scientists, when talking with others, they're neutral. He has a storyline and it has values, and you have to be upfront about the values of the family, even though you're a scientist. And that's hard for us.
It's a terrible. I think we have to conclude in terms of time, but I'd like to thank you all for this extremely interesting discussion, actually. And I think we'll get the recording as well and try to get that across to the Arctic Angel network. Well, thank you, everyone.